On February 12, 1809, in a small town in Kentucky called Hodgenville, Abraham Lincoln was born. He was the second out of 3 children to be born.
Growing up, Abraham Lincoln's mother, Nancy, taught her children about the Bible because she was very religious and believed in education. Schools were very uncommon in these slightly unpopulated areas. When Abe was about 7, a school opened 9 miles away from him. It would take about 2.5 to 3 hours to walk to school, which was a huge commitment. The school didn't last long, but the importance of education was impressed to Abraham Lincoln's mind.
When Abe was 9, his mother became very sick with the milk sickness. The illness took a huge effect on Sally and Abe, and they were left in the care of their father. Abe's father was a big guy known to knock down Abe. Some people view him as an abusive father, and others view him as a man of his day. The house was a mess. A neighbor who stopped by said the kids were terribly skinny, filthy, and the house was a mess. They were alone half of the following year, and one day their father pulled up in the driveway with a horse-drawn wagon with a new wife and her 3 children. Abraham trusted his new mother right away.
Abraham grew big and tall when he was 22, and he moved out to the town of New Salem, Illinois. There, he worked as a shopkeeper, postmaster, and even eventually a general store owner. It was here that he gained great social skills.
After the Black Hawk War, Abraham began his political career and was elected Illinois state legislator in 1834 as a member of the Whig Party. In the election of 1860, Lincoln faced against Douglas, who represented the northern faction of a heavily divided Democratic Party.
As Abraham got older, he began to care more about the issues in the world. He especially cared about slavery. Many countries were already abolishing slavery, and in some cases, it seemed as though it was just becoming the thing to do. Slavery was thought to be dying out. When cash crops started being produced, the southern colonies jumped right back on the wagon of slaves. This made their products sell much faster, and therefore they earned much more profit.
Abe realized that the average free person would work much harder than any slave would, and this scenario would be much more fair. Lincoln also thought that it totally defied what the Declaration of Independence claimed. He thought that it made America appear as less of a leader in the countries of the world.
There was also the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This declared that these 2 new states to the Union would be allowed to choose if they would like for slavery to be in their state. Lincoln tried to convince these states to reject slavery. The only reason why he held back was because he was afraid that this may cause a civil war. Lincoln began to run campaigns in these states with his fellow abolitionists to try to stop these horrible acts.
From the mind of Lincoln, this declared indifference, but as I must think, covert, real zeal from the spread of slavery, I can't but hate. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions with plausibility to taunt us as hypocrites, causes the real friends of freedom to doubt our sincerity, and especially because it forces so many really good men amongst ourselves into an open war with the very fundamental principles of civil liberty, criticizing the Declaration of Independence and insisting that there is no right principle of action but self-interest. The actions that Abraham Lincoln took changed our nation forever. The only thing that the country was concerned about after this issue was resolved was if the U.S. would make it without slavery. As proven by the country, the answer is yes. This act not only lowered the idea of racism, but it also had a great impact on the lives of Americans. Now, the Americans were having to work for their money, rather than having slaves do all the work for them.
Around the time Lincoln was born, the U.S. was at one of its highest peaks of slavery under the 3rd President, Thomas Jefferson, who had slaves himself. The population was about 7 million, of which every 1 out of 6 were enslaved. Of course, at this time, Lincoln had no idea what was going on in the country, but this gives an idea to what life would be like by the time he became president.
In 1808, just before Lincoln's birth, the import of slaves had been officially banned, but this did not stop the Americans from getting what they wanted. Slaves started to be smuggled into the United States. The southern states relied on these slaves and practically could not manage their economy without them.
Abraham Lincoln was extremely against slavery, but not all this was for moral reasons. Slavery went against what the Constitution had, and he was not going to accept that. He began his career by claiming that he was anti-slavery, as shown in his words, "I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I can't remember when I did not so think and feel." Although he says this, he did not believe that the slaves should be treated the same way or have the same rights as the whites. As stated by Abraham himself, "As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master." This expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. The black slaves that were free at the time still did not have the same rights as the white people who lived in the same states. Abolitionists believed that slavery should be immediately abolished and freed slaves should be incorporated as equal members of society. He believed that colonization would resolve, or at least help, the growing issue.
Later, Lincoln issued and signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all slaves would be freed, but this did not actually free all of the slaves, and it did not apply to all U.S. states. Lincoln expressed how he felt about this proclamation through these words, that on the first day of January in the year our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in their rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and do not act or acts to repress such persons, or any of them in any efforts they may make for their actual freedom.
100 years after this was signed, Martin Luther King Jr. gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. In this speech, he states that what Lincoln did for the black slaves was miraculous, but that there was still racism and illegal slavery going on. He felt that there should have been a second Emancipation Proclamation. Martin Luther King ultimately wanted for the blacks and the whites to be completely and utterly equal.
Abraham Lincoln left his views on slavery to be known that he doesn't believe it is right. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in the United States, was passed by Congress on January 31, 1865. It was ratified on December 6, 1865. It provides the demand that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction.
After this amendment was put in place, many people learned that the people who were slaves were no different than they were. They soon realized that they were more than just people who will work.
Abraham Lincoln's stand against slavery is still affecting the lives of Americans every single day. We may not realize it, but this act also affects we, the people who were never slaves. If Abraham had not done what he did, we would never see any person of color doing anything in the U.S. The country would appear as if the only people who were citizens were white. You can still see the effects today by African American people being able to vote since 1965. Even though slavery was abolished in 1865, there is still human trafficking, which is the action or practice of illegally transporting people from one country or area to another, typically for the purposes of forced labor. Even though we still have minor things like this, the ideas of slavery and racism have been heavily lightened by Lincoln.
If Abraham Lincoln could change America forever with just one message, why don't you?